It gives me great pleasure to introduce a friend of the center and a previous visitor, and also the director of graduate liberal studies and associate professor in the Department of English at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sasha Colby. This particular event is co-sponsored by Hamilton Library, Conflict and Peace Specialist, and the Departments of American Studies, Ethnic Studies, History, and Political Science. Right? Sasha is a writer and literary historian, and she's head of the Simon Fraser University's Graduate Liberal Studies program. She's the author of the Matryoshka Memoirs, a story of Ukrainian forced labor, which she's going to be talking about today, the Leica Camera Factory, and Nazi resistance. All of that part of that title that comes from ECW Press, 2003, with the audiobook by Tantor Media. She's got a copy here, and we've got another couple of copies around. She's also the author of Staging Modernist Lives, HD, Minaloy, Nancy Cunard, 3 Plays and Criticism from 2017, and also Stratified Modernism, the poetic excavation from Gautier to Olson, which came out in 2009. I just wanted to mention a number of things. Sasha has done a tremendous amount of work on the implications of performance and aesthetics in relation to culturally and historically specific moments. That kind of focus with a strong performative dimension to it has then fed into the memoir that she has actually written, which is autofictional to a certain degree, but also heavily grounded in her own family history. I was honored to be able to read it beforehand, and what I'll just do is quote from what's actually a blurb on the book. All right. In Matryoshka Memoirs, Sasha Colby draws together treasures from oral history, meticulous research, and her own imagination to tell a story of Ukrainian forced labor, the Leica Camera Factory, and Nazi resistance, but also of 3, and eventually 4 generations of women whose conversations and memories range from Eastern to Western Europe, from Eastern to Western Canada, and from past horrors to the intense, loving family dynamics of recent days. The writing is vivid and lyrical, the narratives are arresting, and the women are unforgettable. And she's going to be introducing you to a number of those women today. A personal note, by some quirk of fate, I actually grew up in Niagara Falls, Ontario. Father actually managed the restaurant right next to the Canadian Falls, which you can imagine what that does to a little boy's imagination. But it worked out. I especially enjoyed reading the memoir because a fair amount of it is actually set in the same thing. So it's a shared imaginative landscape for me, which I left when I was 7. So in some ways, reading this memoir was like coming home. With that, I'm happy to introduce Sasha.
Thank you. How is that for sound? Can you hear me? Yeah. Is the mic picking up now?
Yeah, louder would be good.
Just a little closer. There we go. Now that sounds like amplification, doesn't it? There we go. I just want to thank everyone so much for having me here at the Center. The Center for Biographical Research, I think, is a sort of utopian ideal of what scholarship can be to me because of what a big tent it is in terms of bringing together so many stories. And I was particularly moved and sort of inspired by the line that Craig just quoted, which was sort of the political and emotional consequences. And I think so often in academic contexts we become so embroiled in the political context that we forget the emotional resonance of political context. And yet this is the very thing that will touch people deeply, that will allow scholarship to travel, that would allow us to come together and actually think about histories collectively, is that emotional impetus that sits beside the political. And I cannot think of a better champion for that kind of combined and embroidered work than what happens here. I'm an enormous debt to Craig for his support over the years. You can imagine the first time I came here in 2011, I was performing a 24-character one-woman show about a modernist poet named Hilda Doolittle. There's a limited audience for that, but there was a home for it here. And likewise, to now have written what in many senses is a family memoir, but what I want to talk about a little bit today also is the ways in which I think family is just one more canvas for our scholarship, in a way. And to really divest from one from another risks, I think, that schism of moving the emotional and political away from each other in ways that, again, keep us from connecting in terms of the stories that we've lived. And particularly, I think, sharing those stories more broadly. And I fear for what happens if, as academics, we continue to write only for peer-reviewed journals and don't make the effort to tie our work to stories that can travel, which are the emotional stories, and quite often the family histories, the personal stories, the first-person stories that touch people, draw them in, and allow them to make some kind of connection to the lives that they're living. Otherwise, what are we doing? So I think this centre is enormously important. It's been a beacon for all of that kind of work and more. And I'm just always extraordinarily grateful to be here. The team that puts everything together and makes everything look so easy, and for Craig's leadership and support in reading the book. My editor for this book is Susan Renouve, who is a veteran of Canadian literature and edited Farley Mowat, who's fairly well known in Canada, if not beyond. And as soon as she saw Craig's poke come in, she sort of seized on it and stuck it on the back of the book. And that's the kind of champion that you really need at this moment in publishing, and I'm enormously grateful for it. There's so many things I'd like to talk about, but also because we're a small group, it would be wonderful, I think, to have a conversation. So I do want to leave lots of room for questions. My dad's given me his analog watch so I can keep track of the time. I've given him my cell phone. The last time he had my cell phone, he went to switch it off, and a red button came up, and he thought it was a warning. It was sort of the SOS button that comes up, but he wasn't used to the phone, so he pressed it, and was put through to emergency services. Who immediately asked what his emergency was, and he thought it was a button indicating that maybe the tidal wave was coming, because this is always sort of the possibility on the west coast of Canada. The tidal wave is coming, and so he immediately had to speak to emergency services about the possibilities of what was actually happening with him. So fortunately, he has the phone, I have the watch, nothing will ring. And what I would like to do is tell you a little bit about the background for this story. Which is to say, I think, like most people, when you have histories inside your family home, you don't always see the history because it's caught up in so many canvases that you don't associate with history. It's not on PowerPoint for you. It's not published in an academic book. And so when the history is mixed together with doing the laundry, and cooking together, and family arguments and feuds in the kitchen, it sometimes is masked in ways that we don't quite recognize. And that was certainly the case with my grandmother's story. Irina Kalinic-Nikiforchuk, at the age of 19, was living in a small village in the Ukraine when Nazi forces came and swept up all the young people in her village to be forced laborers in Germany. We knew this. What I didn't know is that she was one of 12 million foreign forced laborers who were brought to Germany in order to work in factories. At one point, foreign forced labor swept up mostly from Nazi-conquered areas of Eastern Europe, accounted for about 1 in 5 in the workforce. So it was an incredible number designed to replace the German soldiers who had gone off to war. And so you had young people working in farms, factories, mines, and doing a lot of the labor that couldn't be done in that time in order to keep the economy going. My grandmother was enormously fortunate in the sense that she was a German speaker because she'd been to teachers' college. And so when she arrived in Wetzlar, Germany, she was put to work in what had been the Leica Camera Factory. She was making camera lenses that were being used for Leica cameras that were being used in a variety of ways by the German war effort, not least of all to photograph the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, and take photographs of what was happening there and make those propaganda photos and to capture the horrors and say, look at these people, look at their horrible, depraved condition, even those conditions have been brought about by the Nazis. Similarly, all sorts of war equipment was being made in the factory and dispersed at that time. Because my grandmother was a German speaker, she ended up working in the camp hospital. Elsie Kühn-Leitz, who was the factory heiress, actually discovered her in the hospital and was looking for Ukrainian German-speaking women who could come and work as domestics in the house. And so she ended up going up to Haus Friedwert, which was the mansion on the hill, and working as a domestic in the household of the Leitz family who owned Leica. And so she had a very different view on the war. She ate reasonably well. She did not endure a lot of what people endured in the camps, malnutrition, beating. The camps were policed by the Gestapo. And she also had a very unusual perspective on the Leitz family and this very, very fine line that they were walking between resistance and complicity. Which is to say, Ernst Leitz, who had taken over the factory from his father, it was a microscope company originally, had been the leadership at the moment where the camera had been discovered. The Leica camera was revolutionary because it used small negatives as opposed to large plates. And this was the thing that made handheld photography possible. Right? The fact that we have little cameras that we can walk around with are really because of a fellow named Barnick who realized that you could actually, who worked for Leica Leitz at that time, that you could actually make these tiny little negatives and then blow them up later. And so in the 20s, Ernst Leitz to introduce these cameras to the retail market, even though it was considered an enormous risk, and evolved an incredibly progressive labor model inside his factories, where the employees were treated very well, had paid holiday. Throughout the inflation of the 1920s in Germany, he was bringing in food from other parts of Europe to make sure that they ate reasonably well, and established a very strong labor situation, including for his Jewish employees. And so as the Nazis took over and things became increasingly tense, leading up to Kristallnacht, the Leitz family decided to get as many of their German and at-risk employees out of the country as they could by sending them to foreign branches of the company. And so they were sending them on ships to New York, to Singapore, to London, to try and get them out of Germany. All of this kept going until the border was sealed. Even then, there is a lot of evidence to show that Ernst Leitz and his daughter, Elsie Kühn-Leitz, were continuing to smuggle people out of Germany, to the point that Elsie Kühn-Leitz, in fall of 1943, was arrested by the Gestapo for a combination of circumstances. One, excessive humanity. Literally, this is the charge. Excessive humanity for the way that she treated the foreign laborers in the camp, who were considered to be Eastern European and therefore subhuman, and also for work she had done to help one Jewish woman and her companion escape Germany. The Gestapo found out, and she ended up in a prison in Frankfurt for 3 months under pretty terrifically awful conditions. And so this book is doing a variety of things. It's a discovery. A lot of it is set in 2011 which was the year that we were visiting my grandmother. She was in her very late 80s, and a very pat narrative that she had had about working in the Leica factory, and then somehow at the end of the war they magically made their way to Belgium and then to Canada, and there really were not a lot of details, but somehow they had made it. And it was sort of all that we had. But by her late 80s, what we were starting to find is there were cracks in these stories, that more was coming to the surface in terms of what she knew that was happening inside the Leitz mansion, in terms of her own escape, which became very complicated by the fact that after the war, the Yalta Agreement said that everyone who was from Soviet territory should go back. And so even though they were being murdered a lot of the time for being traitors, for working for the Germans. So the sort of the complex side of the story came out in this visit in 2011. I started to do the research and to begin to uncover really who Elsie Kühn-Leitz was and what the story of the Leica Camera Factory had been in World War II. And all of these things came together. What I would like to say as a kind of parenthesis on this whole story, as Craig mentioned, I'm a modernist scholar, right? So I do 20th century literature mostly. And so when I wrote this book, a lot of what people say to me is, oh, isn't that nice? You took a break from your scholarship to write about your grandma, right? And this is where I guess I want to, this is the context to do it, because mostly I'll get the support here. Look at me taking the easy route, doing it here rather than a tough conference situation. But I think this is what we have to surmount in a way, is the assumption that our scholarship is one thing and these first-person stories are another. Because in every sense, what I learned in terms of autofiction, the creation of a narrator, comes from the autobiographical writing of modernist women who are doing a lot of this work to beat down the doors of impersonality, to make the domestic a sphere for their modernism. And equally, in terms of technique, and this is what I hope you'll see what I'm going to do next as a reading, is the ways in which one of the major strategies of visual and literary modernism is the strategy of accumulation. So when we think about collage, and we think about Braque and Picasso, it's about layering. And when we think about the poetry of Ezra Pound, it's all about layering, and quite often in modernists like Pound and HD, allowing the energies of the past to come up through that collection and motif of accumulation. That is very much what informs the making of this book, and so I hope that in that sense, it's not just a side project, but actually a renovation of the modernism where my research is located. And so all of these things are going on at once. And I think I will read so that I hope that you can see many of these things occurring, which is to say, that attempt to situate history in the domestic, to give it a more rounded feeling, and perhaps so that other people, here I'm thinking about undergrads in particular, might recognize the history going on inside their homes as history, even when it's embroiled in all these other family circumstances. Also, I hope you'll see some of what I'm doing in terms of collage and accumulation in placing pieces of present day 2011 right on top of or alongside Germany in 1942, so that we get that sense of the past as continuous, right? Of there really, this idea of there being a kind of past-present divide really breaks down in the lives of people for whom World War II continues all the time inside their minds. And I have a friend who taught a course on terrorism, and she said the thing about terrorism, one of the things that's so terrifying about it, is it comes out of the most boring, mundane situation. So you'll be sitting on a plane, or you'll be in a shopping center, and it comes out of nowhere. But the past terrorizes people in that way too, where they will just be attending to their normal day, and the past will come welling up. And certainly this was something I was keen to illustrate in terms of my grandmother's life, even 50, 60 years later in the relative safety of her kitchen in Niagara Falls, Ontario. The past would just come back. So I'm going to read you a few pieces. I'm going to skip around a little bit, starting with this scene in 2011. At my grandmother's house, I always sat in the basement doing a little bit of work. My mum and my grandma would always be in the kitchen upstairs. For a trick of the air conditioning, would kind of hear them, so their conversations would sort of filter down as I was working in the basement. And so that's the setup here, is that I'm working away in the basement. They're upstairs. And my grandmother and my mum are discussing plans to organize a dinner for the following weekend when the family comes. So this is in her house. My grandmother's preoccupation with lace has its own history, rooted in a bone-deep belief that lace symbolizes the triumph of civilization over barbarism, beauty over the brutal ugliness of poverty. As one who traveled from the fields of Stalin-starved Ukraine to a forced labor camp in Hitler's Germany, through DP camps to post-war Canada, she would know. Lace is everywhere in my grandmother's house. The curtains, the doilies, the dining room tablecloth. It is meant to be a barrier. As for me, someone who documents 20th century literary history for a living, I spend a lot of time in libraries and archives and similarly quiet, dimly lit places. Coming from a line of women who traveled far, so far to get where they are, you might ask why I would choose this particular life. I can only speculate that born as I was at the western limit of the western coast, the only place to go was back. I tell you all this because I have become convinced that these movements, like overlapping flight routes in the in-flight magazine of the Boeing 767 that brought my mother and me here from Vancouver, are central to what happened next. All of it, the refugee swell out of the ruins of Europe, the post-war affluence, the restless sense of personal destiny of the 60s and 70s, the more ironic and often less expansive life path forged by my own generation, we strangely acquiescent captives of the millennium, led us to this point. To me, among the pickled beets in the basement, my mother and grandmother in the kitchen above, organizing final details for entertaining the family the following weekend. It is possible that the argument upstairs had been going on for some time, dulled by the floor between us and the hum of air conditioning. But it was in this moment that I became aware of my mother and grandmother's voices. "Ma'am, what's this?" "What's what?" A strained innocence from my grandmother. "This bowl in the refrigerator." "Oh, Lucy, you know, that's just a little bit meat for meat on stick." "But we agreed I'd make lasagna." "Lucy, listen. Laurie and Jerry drive all the way from Rochester to see us. Your brother drive across border from Lewiston. No meat on stick. No vareniki." "Mom, those Ukrainian foods are too much work. Too hard on your back." "Not so hard. I make only some." "You'll make a mountain, I know you. Let me make the lasagna, something in one dish." "They drive so far to see us, and you only make one dish?" "I only mean it will be easier." "Jerry like meat on stick. Always his favorite." "Yes, and he'll like the lasagna too, and so will Laurie." "I know Laurie since she's 5 years old. In DP camp. She almost 70 now. Can't believe." "I know, Mom." "You and Sasha only visit me once a year. Who knows what happened next year? Terrible, terrible thing happens sometime." The electricity of this exchange transmits itself on a current of cool air, causing me to look for my brown suitcase pressed in beside a stack of white plastic lawn chairs. I get up and nab a gift bag from the otherwise empty suitcase. My bare feet slap on the linoleum as I carefully hurry up the 3 stairs to the rec room, up another level to the back door, and one more short flight into the upstairs kitchen. The air is filled with the incriminating scent of garlic. Light streams over the sink through the kitchen's south-facing window, hitting the frame print of the Last Supper that hangs over the kitchen table. My mother and grandmother stand on opposite sides of the kitchen, not more than 4 feet apart. My grandmother in front of the white fridge, My mother beside the cabinets with a peekaboo view into the dining room beyond. Excuse me. My grandmother clutches a giant aluminum bowl of marinating meat cubes to her white lace blouse, a light blue scarf tied around her gray curls. My mother, 60 and looking all of 40, leans against the oven, her shoulder-length blonde hair spilling across her Harley-Davidson t-shirt, which in turn brushes atop of fitted black jeans. In her right hand, she holds the box of lasagna noodles, and I can see her nails digging into the cardboard. I try inserting something into the moat of exasperation. Baba, I got you something, I say, holding out the bag. My grandmother places the bowl protectively on the counter behind her and wipes her hands with a dishcloth. That is Sasha. She accepts the bag and pulls out a gauzy peach-colored scarf with lace edges, rubs the material between her thumb and forefinger, feeling for quality. Beautiful, she murmurs. Thank you, Sasha. Will you wear it to church, I ask, knowing this is the ultimate venue for compliment exchange, the give and take of family trophies. Oh no, she says softly. Too special. I put with my outfit. Your outfit? For the lunch this weekend? No, come with me. You too, Lucy. This discussion isn't over, ma'am, my mother says, tossing the box of lasagna noodles on the stovetop. You never understand when things are too much. Людина не machine. This last line, people are not machines, is something my grandmother likes to say to other people. She waves her hand dismissively and leads us up the cream-carpeted stairs to the bedrooms. Because we are following her, and only because we are following her, my grandmother pointedly uses the hand railing. At the end of the hall, my grandmother turns in her talc-scented bedroom. She moves toward the closet, and my mother and I sit on the far side of the bed, the side my grandmother still sleeps on, turning to the closet doors. The peach bedspread is smooth under my hand, quilted sateen, bought on sale at the Bay or Eaton's. You know where is Lucy? My grandmother asks, pulling on one of the closet's mirrored sliding doors. My special outfit, always left side my closet. She pulls a cream-colored linen dress off the rack. The dress hangs neatly on a wooden hanger underneath a clear plastic dry cleaning bag. My grandmother presses the scarf against the plastic, examining the outfit critically for a moment. Yes, perfect. See, I know. Are you going to a wedding, I ask? No, she says, pleased. This outfit I buried in. Scarf look nice in coffin. Matches material I pick out for lining. I wait for the punchline, but my grandmother is in earnest, the intelligent, hawkish cast of her profile intent on the assessment of her own song. Open coffin in Ukrainian church, Sasha. Need to look good. My grandmother smooths an invisible wrinkle under the bag. Satisfied, she puts the dress back in the closet. Next, she carefully folds the scarf and places the hat shelf on the hat shelf above the dress. Be so nice, my grandmother says with a sigh, her back still turned. Be so nice to make big lunch with you and Sasha, Lucy. One last time. I see my mother's mouth twitch, the hint of an eye roll. Ma'am, you've been saying this for 20 years. My grandmother chuckles, turns her face to us. But every year could be two. Mom, no, it's okay. You don't want to make big lunch altogether. Mom, all special foods. Mom, we made a plan. So, plan change, Lucy. Plan and life change all time. Look at me, graduated as a school teacher in Kiev. But then war come. I bury my teaching certificate under pear tree in village at home. German plane bomb tree, poof, no more teaching certificate. So, lunch menu change. But not such a big change to plan. My grandmother shakes her head, or rather my mother shakes her head, knowing she has been had, and so easily. My grandmother smiles then, and her dark eyes are mischievous and triumphant. You do good job, Sasha, my grandmother says, moving around the corner of the bed to pat my cheek. As she turns, she is framed in the closet mirror by the leaves of the birch trees outside the bedroom window. In most ways, the shift is unremarkable, a brightening of the light, a sudden greenness, a foreign field. June 1942, Wetzlar, Germany. The ground seems to rise and fall in uncertain rhythm as Irina and the others are ordered out of the train cars and marched to a wire enclosure. In a confined cement area with the other young women, Irina is ordered to strip. The girls and women are pushed into a disinfection area, pesticide showers, before being issued temporary shift dresses, clogs, and white and blue badges with the letters OST printed in the center. In a central assembly area, a guard, starched in his tailored uniform, barks sentences in German. A tall blonde woman with startling blue eyes stands beside him. She introduces herself in Ukrainian as Maria Halivata, the camp liaison. When the guard speaks again, Maria translates. They are now Osterweiter, Eastern workers. They will work for the glory of Hitler and the German people. Those who try to escape will be found. Those who do not work will be shot. After this orientation, the women are divided into metal-roofed barracks. Irina is assigned to a room with 7 others, none from her village. At 4:30 the next morning, the women are roused, given 15 minutes to wash in the communal latrines, and issued a cup of water and a small piece of dark, dry bread. The laborers are then marched a half-mile down the road. As they walk, Irina comes to understand the clogs. The clomping of their heels on the ground is as identifiable as a cow with a bell. The guards march the prisoners to one of 2 modern buildings, 10 stories tall with a stern modern facade. Their building has the name Ernst Leitz written at the top in large illuminated letters, bright in the dawn light. The women are divided into work units and given protective clothing. Irina is assigned to an assembly line where glass lenses are packed into cardboard boxes and then into plain wooden crates. The factory smells of nothing in particular, only a numbing efficiency. Every day, Irina stands beside the other women and packs 10 lenses to a box, 12 boxes to a crate. The crates are made of a light wood. The repetitive activity and cool glass are a comfort. The first week, Irina keeps her eyes down, looking at nothing but the glass lenses, the cardboard boxes, the wooden crates. Later, she watches the overseer as he strides along the rows of working women, snapping at a misstep or inefficiency. Irina spends 3 months packing lenses in the factory, days marked by turnip soup, the contractions of hunger pain, and cool, airless work in the factory. At night, in the half hour before the harsh overhead light goes out, she reads her translation dictionary and learns new words in German. Unterwasser, Gefühl, Flucht. She tries to think in sentences that take in more than what is immediately in front of her, but her brain feels stilted, stunned into emotionless observation. The dictionary, the metal bed frame, the fence. One morning, the overseer, a stout grey-haired man in his 50s who spends his time peering over the shoulders of the women, standing too close, stops behind her. "Why are you packing 8 lenses to a box instead of 10? He asks roughly. He moves to pick up the box and show her what he means, but Irina responds. "Because the boxes that arrived this morning are smaller, sir," she says. She has been waiting for this moment to use her German, and is satisfied by the startled look on the overseer's face. He removes his glasses, polishes them with a small blue cloth, replaces them on his nose, looks at her again. "Where did you learn German?" "In school, sir." 2 days later, Irina is transferred to work in the camp hospital under a German doctor named Ron. She and several other German-speaking Ukrainian women translate between doctor and camp patients, wash and bandage wounds, and keep the facility clean. Sometimes, the patients are the youngest workers in the camp, the 13 and 14-year-olds who suffer most from malnutrition. Other days, Irina tends to the newly interned who have been sprayed with the acid-based disinfectant that leaves large red burns on their backs, chests, and legs. One day, she holds the hand of a woman giving birth. Get it out, the woman screams. "It's German, get it out of me, my baby, where is my baby?" Sometimes, at the end of the day, Irina stands at the edge of the camp and looks out into the fields. The fields are endless and look like home. Yes. I'll stop there. You can see, I think, sort of what the method is, I think, in terms of situating the book, right? So inside the domestic, inside sort of the multiple generations, and just a family being a family, and then consistently throughout the book, the past just pops up. Right? And so this is the motion of the telling as the book goes along, until eventually it sort of all comes out, including the fact that my grandparents, my grandmother, grandfather actually met in this work camp, were really meant to go back to the Soviet Union, but they hid in a Polish camp with the help of Elsie Kühn-Leitz. And hiding in a Polish camp that was not under Russian control is actually what allowed them to get out of the country to Belgium and ultimately to Canada. So all of this sort of comes out gradually and slowly, and eventually is also intermarried then with the story of Elsie Kühn-Leitz, particularly those 3 months she spent inside the Gestapo prison, where we learn not just about her story, but also the stories of the other women interned with her in this prison, which is something that can be found in her 1947 autobiographical essay, which became another source for the book. So I think I'd like to focus on what might be of interest, actually, to people if we have time for a bit of a discussion. I think we do. And so I'd certainly invite questions or parallel stories, because I know this story is not unique, right? It's, if not this exact history, it's the kind of thing that happens in lots of people's homes all the time. Great.
If you can talk just a bit, the sections that you were reading there, right? You've got your grandmother who's speaking with a relatively heavy accent, a kind of idiomatic expression, and actually kind of sort of abrupt and contained. And then in the second part, you shifted over to a highly nuanced and detailed response of exactly what she was doing in certain kinds of moments in 1942.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's an auto-fictional dimension. Could you talk about the method by which you turned your lived experience of your grandmother, which I suspect looks more like the kitchen conversations than it did having an opportunity to sit down with her and have her describe in such nuanced detail her response to the day-by-day events in the Leica Camera Factory?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, Harry. And I think, the question you're asking also sits beside one of the major sort of moral questions or complications a little bit, right? Which is to say, on the one hand, this is a book of nonfiction, right? In this end, it's sort of creative nonfiction. On the other hand, it's clearly using fictionalized elements in order to tell the story. And I think there are a couple of things going on to try and broach what you're sensing, which is sort of the disconnect in a way between sort of I don't know how many people have Eastern European grandparents, but there's a mode of expression that is very direct. It tends to be much more forceful. Sometimes when my mom and my grandma are talking about and speaking Ukrainian too quickly, I think they're yelling at each other. They're just talking about what to put in the soup, right? I mean, there's just a different mode of being. So there's sort of that side, which is coming out here, and especially when my grandmother's English was always, for lack of a better word, broken. She never went to school, so it was always expressed fairly roughly. However, if you could get her to sit down and to be still for a while, which was never easy, and talk about her life in those times and fall into a kind of reverie, she actually had an enormous amount of detail at her disposal, and both she and my grandfather were poetry readers, always Pushkin in particular. And there would be a kind of reverie and a kind of richness of the language and the memory when she was speaking Ukrainian, which was very much in contrast to some of the ways in which we'd express each other in daily domestic interactions. So I think it's a couple of things. On the one hand, I'm trying to reflect that more reverie drawn detail that she would present in certain moments if we actually put the tape recorder on and fed her enough questions that she would tell her story in Ukrainian. And then sort of the very direct details. Also, certainly, there's a certain amount of technique involved in terms of fictionalizing the past and drawing on her details and combining them with the enormous amount of reading I did in terms of what was actually happening in the labor camps in that time.
Thank you very much for your reading and speaking to us. Did I understand you correctly that you read your grandmother's memoir that she wrote in 1947?
It was actually Elsie Kühn-Leitz who wrote an autobiographical essay in 1947, and so her part, when fictionalized, is drawn from that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So could you speak more about this text? How would you characterize it? How long was it? And did she speak about her life, like from the very beginning, or did she only focus on forced labor as part of her life experience? Did she embed forced labor as part of her life, and did she try to realize what happened to her? Did she try to analyze it somehow, explain certain unexplainable things to herself or to her intended reader? So I would like to hear more about the text itself, which you used, as you said, yeah, in your writing.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a great question, and it speaks to sources. So just to distinguish some of what I was working with. So very fortunately, my grandmother was alive when I started to transcribe this, and I had a great advantage in that, as opposed to a lot of people who I think try to piece these things together when it's too late. So Irina Kalinic-Nikiforchak, my grandmother, she had dictated a memoir to my mother, which she had written, and which my uncle and aunt had published with some of her recipes. And so I had that text, which was her recounting these details. I had some recordings of her. I had her up until sort of 2013 to ask questions about. The essay from 1947 by Elsie Kühn-Leitz. Elsie Kühn-Leitz was actually trained as a lawyer, and she wrote her PhD dissertation on the inequalities of the German marriage contract. She was never really able to practice law because of the ugly turn that law took in Germany when she was at the point of being able to practice, not least in the way in which it sidelined women. So her essay is quite different from my grandmother's memories and reveries, in the sense that as a lawyer, it was pretty clear that in 1947, even though she didn't want to, Elsie Kühn-Leitz decided, for the sake of history and posterity, to write down what had happened to her in the Frankfurt jail. And so one of the ways in which she steels herself to do this, I think, and this is my interpretation, but one of the ways in which she steels herself to do this is she puts on her lawyerliness. So that essay from 1947 is, by and large, a very stark account of what happened in the Gestapo jail and the people that she met and her interrogators and the kinds of things that she was being asked. I'm looking just for, there is a short part that I actually quote from that essay in the book, which I didn't highlight, but in sum, what it says, there's a sort of paragraph right at the beginning of that essay where Elsie Kühn-Leitz says, that kind of experience is like a mental birthmark that can never be erased. Right? You're always going to carry it. And on some counts, it's very difficult to go back to this time where there was no air and I was suffocating. But at the same time, the absence of truth is its own kind of suffocation. And so in that sense, I think maybe she was processing or asking the kind of reflective questions that you were, in terms of was she looking back and how was she trying to quantify her experience. Overwhelmingly, the drive, I think, for Elsie Kühn-Leitz was historical and legal, which is to get this down so that it didn't disappear. And she says in the essay, I should have done it before, but the house was being watched by the Gestapo, and you don't leave this kind of thing lying around for the Gestapo. So,
Did Did she ever mention your grandmother in any of her recorded materials?
No, she didn't. She didn't.
So it's your
Because
grandmother's memory of her, but
Yes.
no evidence of her memory of your grandmother, because she was writing for very different purposes.
that's true.
Right. And as I recall, the other issue here is in order to keep functioning, right, the family that was running the camera factory had to be Nazis, right? I mean, they had to be part of the party or whatever. So that was the other thing she was navigating.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Elsie Kühn-Leitz herself never became a Nazi, but her father did join the party. And of course, it then becomes you're really splitting hairs a little bit when you then look at all of the companies in Germany, including Mercedes, big companies who were using forced labor, right? And of course, later everyone was claiming that they did it because they had to, or this and that. But there was an enormous amount of money to be made through the whole forced labor endeavor. And so Earthlights did have to go through a public trial in order to be acquitted of any wrongdoing at the end of the war. But he never wanted to talk about, he did not want to talk about the Leica Freedom Train. He did not want to take press queries. This is something that really only came out after his death because he was not interested in talking about it. As is true of so many of the people in our lives probably who don't want to talk about it, right? Sort of want to put it away, even if the stories and the truth itself, almost in spite of them, will keep bubbling to the surface.
Thank you very much. I have 2 points. Let's see if I can ask. The first one is that I remember the end of the war because I was 4 years old, very well. I remember the German, the partisan, the Americans, we running away and hiding and so on. And so I wrote down my memory for my children. And then I had a cousin who is Giovanni Finzi-Contini, who wrote his memory in the same period, but he was older. He was 12 years old. Then there is another distant relative, that is Giorgio Bassani, the author of The Garden of Finzi-Contini, who was older because he was a teacher and then couldn't teach anymore. So what I did, I took the feelings that came out from my memory and I compare in a crude way, not in a narrative, because I'm not a writer, in tables, my feelings connected to certain actions, then the feelings that I felt my cousin had when he was running away from the German, the Nazi fascists, in Italy. And then the feeling which I thought were coming out from this very famous author, Giorgio Bassani. Actually, I got it out from the critics of his books, because he has been studied right and left. And I don't know how much I should pursue the comparative analysis of different feelings connected to autobiographical memory of event with the one that was actually The Garden of Finzi-Contini is more a novel. Or just leave it as it and not to pursue. So this is my first point.
Well, I mean, I think it's wonderful that you're doing it, and I think it's so important because these are our last links to this moment, which is an incredibly important moment in history, not only for its own sake, but because of the repetitions that we're seeing now. Right? And that was one of the eeriest parts of research for this book, is how much you could look at the 1930s and how terrifying it was to learn that Hitler was such a laughable figure, and people laughed at his hair and thought he was ridiculous, and he overtook he overtook a beer hall and people thought this was so funny and sneered at him and thought he was uncouth, and how much we have laughed and stopped laughing on many counts now in our own time. And so I think this is why these stories, like yours, are invaluable, because they're at once a record of a moment that we're beginning to lose, and so valuable if we are willing to spend the time with them to understand where our own currents and moment could go. And I think that first person experience is what will make people feel it. I think you have to do with it what works best for you. I had a lot of advice on how to do this book. Like, write a novel, right? Write a nonfiction account. Don't novelize it, right? And so, I sort of found my way in terms of the way in which I think the story, I think most truthfully lived from my grandmother, but how it lives on in us. And a lot of it is sort of mediated by World War II films, when filming actually is happening in the writing, because that's the way we see it. But because you were there, I think the thing is to just write the experience as truthfully as you can, and to do with it what feels right to you, and hopefully to let other people see it, because I think that is really, really important.
This leads to my second point, is that I wrote down my notes of what I remember as a 4 years old, that are usually very visual, because the German coming up, this runaway, the wounded and so on, just very visual. And I wrote these notes. Then an author that was commissioned the book by a municipality where we were hiding asked me to interview me.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, no need to interview me. Here are my notes. And I gave him my notes. So he used them, and with my permission, of course, because I gave it to him. And he wrote the narrative as an author. So that has been published only in Italy in a big book. I'm wondering if I should forget that and start to do my own writing, maybe in English, of and what I don't know, how much I should go into storytelling. I'm not a writer, and how much I should be just truthful to the event that I remember, that I cannot connect historically, because microhistory, macrohistory connect.
That's the hard work, isn't it? Right? And that will be the hard work of sitting down and seeing what
how did you do it? How, don't you feel guilty of inventing things and mixing together with things that are microhistory of your grandmother?
That's a wonderful question, right?
How do you
That's a
navigate?
I mean, it's an important one, right? Do I feel guilty? I really don't, because this is the truest version I could create, right? Which is to say that there's a theorist named Marianne Hirsch who talks about post-memory, and the idea that second and third generations have of they weren't there. Let's be very clear, they weren't there, but this memory somehow lives on for them in some form. And so I think in that sense, because I know it's very grounded in the details that my grandmother imparted to me, I'm not inventing wildly, let's say, but there's also something that belongs to me here, which is a version that runs through my mind weekly, if not daily, of this story that lives on in my family and lives on in all of us. And that's what this is, right? And if some of those parts are fictionalized by me because there are gaps, then that is a study in what second and third generations do with the absence of detail. And I'm very clear about that in the preface. I think the thing is to be honest up front, right? And so I do have a fairly lengthy author's note where I talk about exactly what my sources are and where I have invented and where I have stuck to the facts as known, and people can take it as they will at that point. It's a great question, it's the ongoing one that plagues this kind of work, I think. Another one building on that one. Go ahead, in the blue shirt.
It's me. Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's been great. And I must admit, I haven't read your book, but I will certainly do because it was so inspiring. And as a scholar myself, and this is somehow tied to what you were mentioning right now, I would like to ask you, how do you come to terms with your scholarly profile and the act of creative writing? Because it's so important, as you mentioned, to maybe get past this idea that the two cannot overlap whatsoever. Just to give you some context, I'm a literary historian of pre-modern Japan, and I'm doing right now a seminar here at UH Manoa and discussing with my grad students that amazing piece of scholarship that is H. Sedgwick's distinction between paranoid reading and reparative reading. I don't want to oversimplify Sedgwick's point, but just to be clear, the textual scholars, especially those doing medieval stuff like myself, are very much into reading too much into the political side, forgetting entirely the emotional side of it. And what she's trying to do is, of course, restore the balance. Both are possible somehow, depending on how you approach your activity of scholar, your idea of self. So I'm just curious as a scholar myself. So from scholar to scholar, how did you navigate that questions that have to do with what we do on a daily basis?
It's a great question. I'm curious what you're thinking, because it strikes me you've got a project ready to come out if you're already thinking about these kinds of questions or working on one now. I think that more lanes have opened up as scholars to work like this, which is, say, between the scholarship and various forms of dramatization. And one of those lanes is research creation, right? And so this idea that we can do creative work informed by the research, which continues to be scholarship because of its commitment to the details, but invites in an imaginative element. And so I think a lot of what I've done in my last couple of books has been very much in that mode, which is to say, my last book was a collection of 3 plays, which dramatized the life and writing of Modernist women. And this book, again, is using a certain amount of hard research and combining it with creative work. What I will say is there'll always be some people who won't like it. Always. But when is that not true in the university, right? When is that not true? And so, at one point in my life, I would get upset about sort of questions about if this was really scholarship. It is, in the sense that it's research derived. If it reaches more people and ends up in public libraries across Canada and the United States in the way that none of my other books have, because it's creatively based, well, that's my answer. Right? And so I think we're not Spice Girls. Do you know what I mean? We don't have to be Posh Spice or Baby Spice. I mean, I think as academics, we can do a variety of things without just choosing a single identity. And in fact, again, I think if our disciplines are to survive, it's likely we're going to have to.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up comment. I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that as scholar, we also should question what we define as scholarship, because sometimes it's just too, oppressive, and again, doesn't allow for, free exploration and pursuing other ways of, coming to terms with the past and what it means to us today. So thank you so much. This has been really inspiring to me. Thank you.
Pleasure. It was lovely to speak with you, with everyone.
Just actually putting both of your comments together, I'm wondering whether a lot of it has to do with issues of reader, and I would like to hear you address who did you imagine would be reading this book? Because I think in terms of determining what you actually do, in terms of what you mix together, is often not so much the consequence of there's a particular formula that you need to do on that and whatever, that the process of tenure and promotion at universities means that there's often a kind of locked-in notion. What they're saying is the readers for this are the people who are going to vote on whether you're tenured or promoted, and that we are basically imitating the mode of what academic scholars who are reading would be like. We deal with it in life writing. For example, in Australia, if somebody does a creative non-fiction piece, like if they write a novel, even if it's heavily researched, they have to write another section of the dissertation, which is just as long, which is a critical analysis of what they did, because they're afraid that somebody will get away with writing a novel and getting a doctorate for it, right? So, and it creates terrible problems, because it usually works out the novel is too short and the analysis is too long, and they can't publish either. But they had to do it because the department's scared that somebody would get away with being creative, right? So I think getting out of that, that's going on anyway, and you know, as Sasha pointed out, people are going to hate what you do anyway, just depending on what they want it to be, right? But I think oftentimes it's a matter of, so Luciano, it's a matter of, you were mentioning, I mean, you wrote this for your children, and I'm lucky enough to know both, but know them. That's often the thing that determines it, and then it often works out that if you do a good job with that and clearly identify who the reader is by the way that you address people, it often works out other people are more than willing to say, hey, I'm willing to be that person for a while, and to actually recognize by the way it's written for someone that they are somebody who can imaginatively engage with that and read that. So I think an awful lot of this stuff has to do with readership, but just as a kind of last mode, who did you think you were writing for when you were writing it?
That's such a great question. Well, you know what? I definitely had to put the TPC committee aside to write this one. Let's put it that way. I honestly didn't have an audience. I mean, I was hoping it would be a broad audience. I knew that it was an audience, you know, that at once it would have to go to the university, but hopefully it would travel beyond. But in this instance, I often wrote it between about 5 and 7 in the morning before my real job started. And I wrote it inside that bubble, just trying to get the truest version I could find it, really not imagining necessarily who would read it, except that I wanted it to be available to the maximum number of people who wanted to read it. And I think that was the imperative in terms of just sentence structure level, right? I mean, this is pretty straight ahead, and for me that was really important, was to communicate directly with whoever was willing to pick it up. And as you were saying to Luciano, if you can write it well, you, I think, luck out, right? That people are then willing to read it and to share it, and it develops a certain momentum.
So much of the time in life writing text, the writer is actually telling you who they want you to be. Right? There's a kind of direct address involved, which basically says, I want you to be this kind of skeptical, or this kind of cynical, or this kind of reader, because I'm actually casting you in that role, because you always need to know who you're talking to. It's something that really gets foregrounded in life writing text in particular. Anyone? Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Sasha. Welcome back.
Thank you.